Hello, everyone. Welcome. We appreciate you all taking the time to join us today during what I imagine is a very busy time in both your home life and your work life. We are really looking forward to spending the next hour and 15 minutes talking with you all about one of the key needs that we have seen emerge for districts during this sort of unprecedented time. And that really is around, over the past 3 months, what unfinished teaching and learning has taken place. Pivot and UnboundEd, we came together as partner organizations to collaborate on developing a toolkit to support districts as they're understanding what unfinished teaching and learning might have happened for ELA and math. And so today we'll be walking you through some guidance around using the toolkit, some framing, and then also just the process and the tools that we'll be offering districts for free. But before we dig in, let's start with a little bit of housekeeping. A thank you to our colleague Emily, who's handling all of the technology on the back end. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a questions box in your dashboard. Anytime throughout the presentation, you should feel free to input any questions you have. We'll collect them and we'll have time at the end for a Q&A. A note about the chat function. It's not a group chat function like you might see in Zoom or some of those other video conferencing platforms. It only is a way to communicate directly with Emily, who's on the back end. So if you have questions or need help with anything during the webinar, there is a little hand raise button in your dashboard on the right, and you can click that and we'll reach out and help support you with any questions that you might have during this time. At the end of this, when you log off, you'll receive a short feedback survey. We would love for you to complete it. Feedback for us on the presentation, the content, all of that is super important, so we can make sure we're providing you all with really helpful resources and supports. Lastly, we are recording this slide deck, and we will be sending the deck and the recording along with the toolkit to all folks who registered for the webinar by email tomorrow. So now, who are we? Who are your tour guides for today? I am Elizabeth Mackey. I'm a senior program manager at Pivot Learning. The work that I do is in the curriculum and instruction program. We support districts in the adoption and implementation of high quality instructional materials. And so that's what I do. I work directly with districts in doing that really important work. And we are so excited to have Josh and his expertise here today as well.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Happy to be on the call with you all, and welcome to everybody that's joining. I echo Elizabeth's sentiments from earlier in this extraordinary time. Thank you for taking the time to learn with us. My name is Joshua Parker. I'm Director of Programs and Engagement for UnboundEd, and I principally work with the cohort programs, the System Leader Academy, and the Equity Influencer Residency. One of our districts this year, we've actually had the pleasure of partnering with Pivot and helping them, that's Stockton Unified School District. So I've worked with Elizabeth, know her well, and excited to really be your tour guides, I like that, for this learning journey. Excited to be here.
Great. And to give you all a little more context for our organizations and the work we do, Pivot Learning is a nonprofit that works nationally with school districts and other state and advocacy type organizations to support implementing solutions that move districts towards educational justice for all students. And specifically in curriculum and instruction, we really dig into how do we build district systems and capacity to implement high quality instructional materials in service of equitable student outcomes. And we are really thrilled to do this work in partnership, as Josh mentioned, with UnboundEd, which is a phenomenal organization.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and happy to represent all of my colleagues and our CEO, Lacey Robinson, on this call. UnboundEd provides training and tools to empower educators to center equity in their instructional practices. Our website is on the screen, www.unbounded.org. And we believe that when you center equity, you're actually centering the children. And so it's important that our children come first and the adults that support them get maximum quality professional development to help all children learn well. So happy to be continuing our partnership with Pivot Learning today.
And now we want to know who you are. So in just a moment, a poll will pop up on the screen with you all to give a chance to let us know who's joining us today in terms of your role and the work that you do. So when that pops up, you'll have an opportunity to click.
And we'll give you about 20 or 30 seconds to put that answer in. All right, and looks like our voting has slowed down, so we'll share who is with us today.
All right, we've got a really good mix. Clearly, Josh, we should have added some other categories. If folks want to enter into the chat what your roles are, we'd love to know some of the other folks who are joining us. Great, so let's talk a little bit about how we are going to spend our time together today and what we hope you guys will get out of this next little period of time. So first of all, we'll talk about learning objectives, what we hope you'll be able to walk away knowing and being able to do. Then we'll do a little bit of context setting around this concept of unfinished learning. We'll then jump into framing unfinished instruction and how you can approach the framing of it in your district as you're beginning to think about leveraging this toolkit and doing this work. Then we will dive into the Equitable Learning Recovery Plan, so helping you understand the toolkit and the process that we recommend. And lastly, we'll have a little bit of additional supports that we offer at the end. So please do stick around because there's some great stuff at the end that will help you understand other ways you can leverage resources in support of doing this work. So today, our hope for you as participants, and this is pretty ambitious, I think. There's a lot in here, but hopefully we'll get to all of these things. First and foremost is walking away understanding unfinished instruction and learning. So really having a working definition and a way of positioning this within, you know, the craziness of what's happened in the past few months for districts across the country. We also will dig into understanding technical and adaptive challenges, specifically in the context of remote learning, and also thinking about how you use an equity lens in the context of remote learning. So 2 framing pieces to help set up your district's conversations and thinking about this work. And then as we dig into the toolkit, we'll talk a lot about how you leverage specific ELA and math instruction data to map out unfinished teaching and learning across your district. And then lastly, we'll talk about how you can specifically use the toolkit, which is the process and the associated tools that we'll be providing for free to all registrants and then on our websites as well after this webinar. With that, I'll kick it off to Josh to help us start defining unfinished learning.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we're going to do all that in less than 60 minutes. So buckle up. Our learning objectives for this particular section are that people will understand unfinished instruction and learning in our current context, and also understand the technical and adaptive challenges presented by virtual learning. So looking forward to share that with you right now. So I want you to look at the screen. You'll see these intersecting ribbons, and on one, you'll see unfinished learning, and on another, you'll see unfinished teaching. You know, you might have heard other terms in this space, such as the coronavirus slide or gaps in learning. What we want to really emphasize right away is that it's important that we define unfinished instruction as the combination of both. It can be very easy for all of us to think about, well, what learning are students not getting in this space? But it's just as important to understand what teaching have they not been provided. And so on this particular slide, we've broken down unfinished instruction into unfinished teaching and unfinished learning. So unfinished teaching are when grade level standards and concepts that were not directly taught nor assessed prior to students entering the next grade. Then grade level standards and concepts that students did not demonstrate proficiency in prior to entering the next grade, we call unfinished learning. What is important before going to the next concept where we really give you this definition is to understand that there is a connection between the two. And when you can share the responsibility for the learning and teaching, When you can share what is unfinished, you can share in finishing the unfinished. So we want to really take us out of the idea of putting deficit language on our kids or even on our teachers. Everyone's unfinished at this point. And so everyone can then collaborate on finishing the unfinished as we continue to achieve and advance to a new normal. And which brings us to the definition that's going to start to set our learning for today. So we define unfinished instruction as any combination of teaching and learning occurring within an academic year that fails to provide students with the opportunity to demonstrate proficiency with grade level skills through texts, tasks, and or problems. So I want to draw your attention to a couple of words here. The first is fails to provide students with the opportunity. It is about the opportunities we give students that truly determines the completeness of their instruction. Also, the combination of teaching and learning, I just talked about that a little bit ago, so that the responsibility for learning is really shared. It is key to note that unfinished instruction is not just a feature happening under the specter of COVID-19. It's actually been happening, especially with our Black and Brown students. The pandemic has not exposed it, it has emphasized it. And so we are really at a great chance, and I'm really glad so many people are on this particular webinar, because this is our opportunity to stop something that has already been happening, but it's just been exacerbated. We are doing what is right for kids when we focus not only on what was not learned, but on the opportunity they had to learn the content in the first place. When we support teachers to provide access to the work of the grade, we can truly begin to finish the unfinished. So I want us to really start in that space. But there's a problem. If I'm trying to finish the unfinished, strategy is really important. So I really don't want to take any sort of detours because time is precious. So in the next particular section, I'd like to introduce you to some solution detours that sometimes we can take when we are actually trying to finish the unfinished. So establishing or reframing a district-wide plan for providing access to equitable education in these times is really, really critical. In a recent article by Paul Gorski, he outlined several equity detours that can happen as people attempt to make equity work in their districts, but end up going down the wrong path, even though their stated goal is just the opposite. In the spirit of that article, we have identified through our work in the System Leader Academy and Equity Influencer Program and collaboration with Pivot Learning some common solution detours. These detours get us off the right path because they appear to resolve issues of inequity, but in most cases only reproduce them. So there's 3 of them that we're going to get into, and we're going to get into the first one right now. I'm going to go off of your screen so that you can really focus on the content. I really would like you all to zoom in on this particular concept. So the first solution detour is solving adaptive challenges with technical solutions. Dr. Ron Heifetz, who wrote The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, says that the single biggest failure in the exercise of leadership is to treat adaptive challenges like technical problems, and therefore to apply technical solutions. If you look on the screen, you see some of the attributes of technical problems versus adaptive challenges. In that sense, it's important to characterize those differences. What I'd like you to remember is that technical problems are easy to identify and lend themselves to concrete solutions. These are important in that they allow us to solve low-hanging fruit, low-hanging issues, and are the oil that maintains systems that we all depend on. However, adaptive challenges require a different depth of commitment. These challenges are difficult to identify and easy to deny. In fact, they require changes in values, beliefs, roles, relationships, and approaches. These type of changes actually anchor transformation. So I want to give you a close to home example. So my son has work to complete every day and it has to be checked. That's a technical problem. When I found out yesterday that he guessed the right answer on an assignment about angles and didn't have the conceptual knowledge, it presented quite an adaptive challenge for me. How do I have to change my approach to get him to value that level of work? I'll check back with you when and if I've achieved either. What is important to remember from this concept is not to rank one over the other, even though it feels easier to really do a technical solution, but to make sure that you are applying the right solution for the right challenge. On this next slide, here are some examples of technical and adaptive challenges from our current contexts. So you'll see that the technical side speaks to access, students having access to internet and devices for remote learning. That doesn't mean it's not important for that to be solved, but the adaptive challenge has to be added as well. Once students have access to the internet and devices for remote learning, how are they engaging in meaningful grade level instruction while on their devices? It's really critical that we combine both the technical and adaptive, because if I think that I'm solving a student engagement problem by just giving kids access to devices, then I have not solved the actual underlying issue. I'm really excited also to share this toolkit and process with you because it's actually going to help us resolve both of those issues. As you review data, be sure to be curious enough to figure out which parts require adaptive solutions and which parts require technical solutions. Author Ruha Benjamin wrote that the path to inequity is paved with just technical fixes. So avoiding this solution detour can also help with the second solution detour. This second solution detour is providing direction without systemic support. So I'm going to read to you a scenario that might be familiar for you. Here is the scenario. As teachers face a summer of unpredictability, they are greeted with an email from their principal. In this communication, several new ways of educating students, quote, in this volatile and complex time, end quote, are presented in a bulleted list. The changes are significant, altering both the structure and delivery of instruction and the ways teachers will assess and be assessed on its effectiveness. The email concludes by mentioning that there will be a single 2-hour training to help support teachers in this, quote, needed change to support a quality education for all, end quote. As I mentioned earlier, you may have received or even written this type of email in the past few weeks, and it was probably necessary, required, and well received. You all are really trying your best. We all are trying our best. So providing what Michael Fullen calls focusing direction is a right driver for transformation, and it's just what we leaders do. I'd like you to begin, though, to view this action not just through the lens of intent, but also impact. What could be the impact of staying at the level of this email? According to studies found within a book entitled Achieving Coherence and District Improvement, changing structure without complementary changes in systems and resources will be ineffective. Therefore, focusing direction must be accompanied by systemic support, or some things can really happen that will derail our change effort, which is where we're going to talk about next. So, how could providing only direction be a detour? Well, let's get into this. First, action from those carrying out the directions changes from collaboration to compliance. The second way this could be a detour is that adaptive challenges of those implementing the directives go unaddressed, stalling the change effort. Thirdly, without deep structural support for equitable instruction, inequities will reform and solidify. So this is really, really key. If we think about this in terms of staying at the level of the email and not providing robust and comprehensive systemic support, that some of these potential detours could crop up in our work. And we are at a golden opportunity to actually create the type of systems and learning that all of our children need and deserve. And so the first detour is trying to solve an adaptive challenge with a technical solution. The second solution detour to avoid is providing direction, but not providing systemic support. And the last detour to avoid is collaborating only through an access lens. So here's a quote by Victoria Bernhardt, who wrote several books on data analysis. She says, data analysis should be about helping schools and system leaders understand if they are achieving their purpose and guiding principles and meeting the needs of all students. And if not, why not? And that's a really, really key point. I want to bring us back to a couple of pieces that are here. Collaboration itself is the right move, but look into those words. Are we meeting the needs of all students? And if not, why not? The why not requires not just to focus on access, but about the quality of instruction to those who have the access. And that requires us to collaborate with a wide variety of voices and also to consider what we are asking those we collaborate with. And that leads us then to what are some of the actions of this detour? What are some of the actions of this detour? And so some of the actions include engaging with caregivers and students about their access to instruction without questions about the quality of instruction. Another action of this detour is assessing student progress without considering instructional and curricular moves. The last action of this detour is making conclusions about instructional effectiveness without considering the voices of teachers and school leaders. I want to break this down just a little bit. So let's start with the first piece, engaging with caregivers and students about their access to instruction without questions about the quality of instruction. An access lens focuses on the fact that they have the devices, which is great and necessary. An equity lens moves further and is concerned with what the quality is on the devices and how it can be supported. With the second potential action, an access lens views student progress as quality or rate of completion of assignments. An equity lens builds on that to articulate the connection between student work and instructional and curricular moves. Finally, with the third action of this detour, making conclusions about instructional effectiveness without considering the voices of teachers and school leaders. An access lens concludes that effective instruction is based on it happening consistently. An equity lens builds on that to confirm that the story of instruction is backed up by the voices and experiences of those implementing it. We will talk more about having an equity lens a little bit later in the presentation. To sum up, solving adaptive challenges with technical solutions, providing direction without systemic support, and collaborating only through an access lens are common solution detours that we can easily fall into on the way to earnestly trying to make the right decisions. It is important also to note that detours may come from within us, but can also come from the people we support. They can push us into a detour due to their perspective of how to solve an issue. It is important that we are aware of this possibility and plan our responses to be inclusive, informative, and thorough. Now it's time for us to take a little time to check in and want you to consider any questions you might have about those solution detours, any thoughts that you might have. Take a few moments right now to write yourself a note. You can put it potentially in the chat or just write it wherever you're taking notes. What other questions are coming up for you about unfinished instruction, technical and adaptive challenges, and using that right data that we talk about, not just looking at it through an access lens? So we'll pause for a couple of seconds for you to write down a couple of questions you might have, and we're going to continue on with the presentation.
Thanks so much, Josh. And again, flagging that we will have a Q&A at the end. So as you have questions, please do enter them in that question box on the right-hand side so we can learn more about what you want to know more about. So how can we address unfinished instruction now that we have a working definition for it? Thank you, Josh. That was a great summary. And then also, how can we avoid those 3 detours that Josh brought up as we move through this process? So in general, looping back to what Josh said about adaptive and technical work, when you embark on this project, on this process, really framing the work of unfinished instruction in your district's broader context. This is adaptive work. It is not going to have quick fixes. And this is also systemic work, meaning it impacts all parts of your community within your district. It needs to be considered in relation to those. And secondly, as Josh mentioned on the 3rd detour, really being intentional about what data you're gathering on unfinished instruction, and then how you're analyzing that data as you begin to build your equitable learning recovery plan. So in this next section, we will be talking a little bit about framing this in your district. So when you start this work, you start this process and begin using the toolkit, what are some of the perspectives you need to have to make sure you're focusing on equitable instruction as you are considering what happened for remote learning in your district? First of all, there is a lot happening in districts right now. There's a lot happening for everyone as districts have shifted very quickly to remote learning, and there are a lot of needs that are emerging. So what we're talking about today is one slice of a much bigger picture, and we would encourage you to put this work situated alongside other equally important work. And some of those areas to explore and investigate are listed here, and we have just some starting place references with resources for you to help understand and address some of the needs that are popping up in these different areas. So in terms of focusing in today on the work of this equitable learning recovery plan, one of the key things to think about in framing is focusing on the impact of the last 3 months of the impact that COVID-19 has had for your district system for ELA and math core instruction. So how can you really understand, both access and quality of unfinished ELA and math instruction? And then based on that, how can you begin to prepare your teachers to meet needs that are coming up and to do them in a way that is centered on equitable student outcomes? And so for the first one, understanding the scope of unfinished ELA and math instruction in your district. These are a few key questions that we would encourage you to think about and hold closely. So first of all, what was stakeholder experience? And as Josh mentioned, it matters not just what data you have, but who you got that data from. Are you getting a really diverse representative group of all of the different families and students and teachers and staff within your district to understand what's happening? Are you understanding the quality of your materials? Are you presenting students and teachers with the opportunity to access grade level instruction by providing them with the right materials? And then thinking through, both what was the experience of instruction and who had access to that instruction. And then finally, really thinking about, did educators feel like they had the support and the capacity to do what is a pretty monumental task of shifting to remote learning in a matter of weeks? So those are a few questions to consider. And all of those are in service of thinking about how you prepare teachers to build their capacity to address unfinished instruction. So this process and this toolkit are focused on, at the end of it, being able to plan for supports over the summer for educators. How can you build competencies, skills, and knowledge for your educators so that when you return in the fall, your students are having a different experience? And what we would say is you're going to gather this data, and there is going to be a lot of needs that arise. There already is, I imagine, an overwhelming amount of needs within your district that are surfacing. And what we would really encourage you to do is prioritizing the experience of students who are traditionally underserved by public education. These are your students of color who are often denied access to grade level content. These are your English language learners whose parents are trying to figure out how to support instruction in a language that is not their primary language at home. So as you begin to plan for and prioritize in your analysis of your data and in your planning for teacher supports, really holding those populations' experiences at the center and thinking about the supports that they need first. And so next we will have, Josh is gonna walk us through an equity lens, thinking about, okay, as we move through this process, how do we keep equity at the center then?
Hey, Elizabeth, thanks so much for that. And I was thinking about something. If you can go back one slide, Emily, I was thinking about something that you were saying. I love how you laid out what the parameters of this tool are. And I keep going back to this idea of unfinished instruction. And I think about, I was 10 years in a classroom and 13 years in a district. I'm thinking about, as I am trying to address unfinished instruction, and we have a toolkit that's going to help us do that, I don't want my leading to be unfinished. Like as a school leader or even as a system leader, I don't want to have unfinished leading. And that, that's something that I'm thinking about as you're speaking, and I want to really get into it with this equity lens.
Great.
So this next piece is we talk about unfinished instruction. We want to make sure that we're not just looking at data and thinking that the story of the data is the only thing that's influencing what we do with the data. And so it's highly important that we use an equity lens to strategize and prioritize. It's really, really important. Our lenses or perspectives, as mentioned earlier, greatly impact what we will do next. Our perspectives of student achievement are influenced by our experiences, and these experiences impact our beliefs, which ultimately play out in the policies, practices, and procedures we will employ as solutions. I want to really draw our attention to this point. Your solution is only as clear as your lens. Your solution is only as clear as your lens. For example, if data revealed that a majority of Black and Brown students have unfinished instruction in the area of operations and algebraic thinking, a lens of equity looks for how the instructional and curriculum moves, as well as system, policy, and practices has led to this outcome. A lens of inequity sees this as a student learning problem or even attributes it to a coronavirus slide, as mentioned earlier. And I hear the voice of my CEO, the slide has been happening before the pandemic. So looking with an equity lens better informs the recovery. In order to develop this, you could ask yourself the following questions. What do I know about my district's racial history? How have my system or school's policies, practices, and procedures contributed to the unfinished instruction before COVID-19 was here? Finally, in what ways have I accounted for possible racialized academic harm in my selection of content and instructional practices? The way we frame issues of student progress is very important because frames hold pictures. So we want to be sure that the picture we are all seeing is the right one. There is another action that can enable it, which I will get into on the next slide. So establishing a shared definition of equitable instruction, no matter the subject area, is critical to a right interpretation of data. With this definition, as well as what we learned earlier about unfinished instruction, you can frame data you receive from the toolkit in a way that honors the worth of all children. If you don't have a shared definition of equitable instruction that everyone has in your system, because everybody has their own definition, but is it shared and equitable? Feel free to use the one that we use at UnboundEd. We define equitable instruction as learning that is grounded in the intersection of the standards, content, aligned curriculum, and the equity that is essential for closing the opportunity gap caused by systemic bias and racism so that all students experience engaging, affirming, and meaningful grade level instruction. So that's a mouthful. I want to bring you back to some key words. The intersection of standards, content, aligned curriculum, and equity. This is the heart of what we believe at UnboundEd. It ensures that nothing is left off the table when we are talking about the instruction that all kids, especially our Black and brown kids, deserve. In times past, we have discussed these elements separately. The toolkit that we provide today helps us to bring them together. Also, the words engaging, meaningful, and affirming grade level instruction. If you remember nothing else from this section of the presentation, please remember this. The instruction that we seek is an education that seeks to affirm who they are and how they show up by delivering instruction that is meaningful to them and reflective of grade level expectations. High quality instruction is the equity move, and this is our work. If you'd like to do a deeper dive on what this definition means and how you can be equipped to provide it throughout your school and district, come and learn with us in our upcoming virtual summit, which you will hear about at the end of this presentation. So now it's time for a poll. How has your district addressed equitable ELA and math instruction as it has shifted to remote learning?
All right, and you should get the poll pop up on your screen in just a second, and we'll again give you about 20 or 30 seconds to put in your answer. All right, and we'll give it just about 5 more seconds. Looks like we've got a lot of votes in. There are our results.
Great. Yeah, it's really interesting to see that. Great to see that basically, roughly even that there is some guidance on equitable remote instruction alongside, what we might expect to see, which is that districts haven't yet had the bandwidth to specifically address this issue. Most of the districts I've been in touch with have been, forefront of their minds, understandably, getting meals to students, making sure folks had access to the internet and devices. But definitely hoping that we would see a shift in this over the next few months as people begin to get more acclimated to remote instruction. And it's, oh, go ahead, Josh.
I'm sorry, if I can see that poll just one more time. I think it's super instructive, right? So out of the people that are on this call, most of the districts have not specifically addressed the issue. But also look at the 3 that are even below the middle on guidance, right? Deepen our competence, held virtual town halls. I'm so glad that we have this toolkit that we're about to introduce to them because it can resolve some of these issues.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really helpful. Thank you all for participating. It's helpful to know where you are at and what's happening in your districts. So thank you, Josh, for diving into the lenses for equity. So with all of that framing that we've given you and all of those things to consider, what we're going to jump into now is building an equitable learning recovery plan. So in this section, we'll go through the process and the toolkit that we've created to support that. And by the end of this section, hopefully you'll be able to understand how to leverage specific instructional data in ELA and math, and talk about what has unfolded over the past few months in your district. So what is an equitable learning recovery plan? So the way that we think about this is not just understanding what units were covered, what lessons were covered, speaking to what Josh had said earlier about not just understanding access, but really thinking about this process and centering students who are traditionally underserved by public education in this process. So what happened for your Black and Brown students over the past 3 months? What happened for your students for your students with disabilities whose families are working full time? Really thinking about some of these populations in a very specific and strategic way. Also, as you're going through your equitable learning recovery plan, you want to be data driven, but driven by the right data and data that has a diversity of perspectives behind it. And then, as you're looking at this data and focusing on unfinished instruction, really approaching it with a capacity building mindset and an asset building mindset. So we're not looking for what do people not know how to do, what went wrong, avoiding the blame placing, and really thinking about this data is showing me that I need to build capacity for my school leaders, for my teachers, for my coaches in these ways. And really thinking about what assets they have that you can build on. And most importantly, really having a curiosity about how your district system can know more and do better for these students who are traditionally underserved. So with those in mind, we are going to walk you through the process that we've laid out in the toolkit and with some guidance and suggestions for how to use it. So the first thing to consider is what the toolkit can do and won't do for you. So first of all, it's really focused on gathering data on unfinished ELA and math instruction for the past 3 months. You will have had systems likely in place for understanding your instruction prior in the school year, but in the past 3 months when everything has really shifted, digging into what happened for ELA and math instruction specifically. Focusing specifically on equitable instruction, we are getting below the surface of did instruction happen, and we're asking questions about what was the quality of instruction for specific student groups that are often denied access to grade level standards and materials. And then focusing on what you gather from this toolkit and planning on building capacity, building the competencies of your teachers over the summer. And lastly, this toolkit really does try to leverage a diversity of voices from stakeholders across your district system. What this toolkit doesn't do, and this is maybe as important as what the toolkit does, is it is not meant to be evaluative for teachers, students, parents, caregivers, school leaders. This is not meant to identify or assign what went wrong. It is meant to really uncover where do we need to build capacity as a system and where do we need to provide more support for equitable instruction to happen in a remote environment. And as we mentioned before, this shouldn't be the only data point. This should sit within a much larger body of work and questions you're asking about the other parts of your system that impact instruction. So with all of that, the few things that we flag for you as you begin this process are, where you should focus, which we've been over, and then also really using a systems perspective. So your instruction that's happening within classrooms, virtually or in person, is related to so many other things. Are kids coming to school hungry? Do they have the materials they need? Are their parents able to access the teacher to ask questions and provide support? There's so many different things. So really thinking about this from a systems perspective. And in service of that, you need to build a cross-functional team. You need people with different perspectives across your district system so that when you're looking at data, you have a really rich understanding and a diverse group of perspectives to inform the analysis of that data. And then lastly, this toolkit is robust. We hope we've provided you with some good resources and tools alongside the process to implement, but you may need to select specific tools to use based on your capacity, and you also may need to look at specific grade bands or content areas. We encourage you to do the whole thing if you can, but doing some portion of it is better than not having any information on what's happened for ELA and math instruction. So the process for doing this, we recommend about 5 weeks. You may want to spend more time or less time depending on what you have capacity for and what's happening in your district right now. But in the first week, you'll basically form your team and begin to determine who will collect data and when. In the second and third weeks, you'll collect data. In the fourth week, you'll come together and you'll analyze that and infer some findings from that. And then finally, using the findings from your data collection, you'll make a plan for professional learning for teachers over the summer. So in week 1, so now we're going to dig into each week step by step for you all and talk through sort of what happens. There is a lot more guidance in the toolkit itself. So when you all receive that tomorrow, you can dig in and read through. So this will just be an overview. So in week 1, you're going to launch your team. So that is getting folks together, making sure it's a diverse group of people, that you're representing key stakeholders, and you are going to establish your purpose. It's really important that people understand why you're doing this. We are doing this in service of understanding, is equitable ELA and math instruction happening in our remote classroom environments? And then you'll also do some of the technical work of, right, who's going to collect this data? When do we need it by? Those questions are kind of, tedious but important to answer. And as you're digging into this, the questions that we would have you consider or frame, on the next slide, we'll dig into them, are ones that you would have in conversation throughout the meeting. So your launch meeting. So those questions, Emily, if you could jump to the next slide. Thanks. So you're obviously going to be asking about access, right? And as Josh mentioned in the data section under equity detours, the key is you need to understand access to understand whether or not students even have the opportunity to learn, but you also need to go beyond that. You need to understand the experience of your students and teachers and parents and guardians to lay alongside those metrics about access. And specifically, once you get information about access to instruction and how instruction felt for them, really looking deeply at your priority student groups. And as Josh mentioned, thinking about what barriers are popping up, not just in the context of the last 3 months, but in the history of your district and your city. Are these barriers that your students of color continually experience, that your students with disabilities continually experience? So really thinking as you begin to dive into this process, thinking about students at the front. So in the next step, so in weeks 2 through 3, what you'll do is you'll collect data. And we've provided you in the toolkit with surveys that you can either administer in hard copy or digitally, or what we would recommend is inputting into your own survey system for students, for teachers, for parents and guardians, and then for site-based staff, coaches, principals, assistant principals. And so basically in this time period, you will communicate out the purpose of the needs assessment. You'll send out the surveys with a request for when folks complete them. And then you will also go and you'll gather data from your online systems. And we've provided some guidance on what data points you would want to gather. But essentially, are students and teachers logging into your synchronous learning systems like your video conferencing, and are they accessing asynchronous materials like your online curriculum platform, so that you can lay these two types of data together. And so some tips that we have for collecting survey data. This is, I think, as important as getting the survey out is making sure that what you are putting out is accessible to populations who typically don't have access to providing feedback. If you have multiple languages in your district, which you very likely do, you would want to make sure that the survey is translated. You would want to make sure that if you have families that don't have consistent access to the internet, that you're distributing or administering this in a hard copy format or some other format that's accessible. And also being really clear about the why. So letting folks know we need your information, your perspective, your experience, so that we can know more and do better. We need to understand what was it like for you over the past 3 months. And so folks understand that their voice is really valuable and their experience is really valuable in setting the direction for the district. And then being really transparent. This is a huge step in equity, is how in equity within your systems is being transparent about what you're doing and why you're doing it and what might come from it. So people can trust that the information that they're giving you is going to be used in a way that's helpful to them. So after you've collected your data, you will come back together in week 4 and you'll analyze that data. This looks really simple on the screen right now, but it is probably the most complex step because you'll have a lot of data and you'll have a lot of information, and making meaning of that data will be a robust conversation with your team that's doing this work. And so essentially in this period, you would go through all of your data, summarize your findings, and then think about, particularly as you're going through your data and summarizing your findings, those priority student groups. And so we provided a data analysis protocol to help frame some of those conversations as you're looking at your data. But specifically, there are a few key questions or ways of looking at this that we'd recommend. So the first is experience. Again, really wanting to understand not just the numbers of who had which online accounts and who showed up to classes, but what was their experience? What was happening for them in the background behind the Zoom meeting or behind the Microsoft Teams meeting? And then really digging into materials, because they could be showing up, but if you are not putting grade level high quality materials in front of students, you are denying them the opportunity to access grade level standards. So really understanding the quality of what you're producing and providing teachers for instruction. And then finally, thinking about what was the experience of ELA in math instruction. Really understanding, did students and teachers and parents and caregivers have a shared understanding of that? Did they disagree on certain points? What did asynchronous and synchronous instruction look like for them in these areas? So those are a few of the key topics that are a part of the data analysis protocol to consider. And then finally, you'll have done, here we are already at week 5, yay. You will have done, you'll have launched your team and set your purpose. You'll have gathered data. You'll have looked deeply at that data as a team. And then finally, you'll take your findings from that data and you'll begin to make a plan for summer teacher supports. And this is something that, as we were developing this, Josh and I actually went pretty deeply into thinking and talking about, which was this part, the planning part, should really deeply be thinking about, from a district systems level, what competencies, skills, and knowledge do I need to help my teachers build so that they can provide equitable ELA and math instruction. So in this part, you're going to have some technical challenges that arise and that you'll want to address, right? You will have your, this percentage of students doesn't have internet, or only 50% of our students are logging on to the curriculum platform. How can we solve that? So part of this will be making a list for your district of technical things that you need to resolve. But we really encourage you to move beyond and focus on the capacity building needed for teacher supports. So how can you help them understand what is your vision for equitable ELA instruction in a remote learning environment? And how can I as a district leader over the summer help teachers get there? What supports, what professional learning do we need to provide as a system to make sure that we're building those before school begins again in the fall? There are a few questions here that we would encourage you all to consider as you're planning. But one of them is, again, and I'll sound like a broken record about this, but prioritizing, your students of color, your English language learners, your students with disabilities. So instead of thinking about how can we resolve the issue for the majority of students that people are having and expressing in our data, think about, okay, we know that for students who are traditionally underserved, these are some barriers that are popping up that are either new or have been there forever and we're just now seeing them. Here's how we're going to address those. Because you will have more to do than you can accomplish in the summer, because it's going to be a short summer. And so thinking about keeping equity at the center of that conversation as you're having it. And then again, really encouraging folks to think about not just addressing unfinished instruction from this prior year, but continuing to think about as we move forward in a time of great uncertainty next year, how are we thinking about continued access for all students to grade level content and standards, to high quality, standards aligned instruction and materials? So really thinking about those pieces as well as you're planning. So that is a brief overview of sort of the process that we recommend and a little bit of a peek at some of the tools that we are providing so that you can leverage that process and make the most out of it. We hope for it to be, you know, small enough that it feels manageable for you to do before the summer, but also to provide enough guidance and support so you really are able to think about equity within this context of ELA and math with remote instruction. So in thinking about if you do this plan, if you gather this data, what does that mean for how this work could impact your district? And Josh is gonna kind of give us a little bit of a peek into that.
Thanks for that, Elizabeth. I love how you laid that out. And that really brings us to sum up a good portion of the presentation. And after this, we're gonna go on camera and have a question and answer session with people that are in this particular webinar. And after that, there's even more that we're going to provide for you. So this has been a really, really great presentation. I'm excited to do a Q&A with you all. So to sum up this presentation before our Q&A, you all are doing the very best you can do to provide the best support to teachers and students this summer. So what this tool and process does, which Elizabeth did a great job of laying out, it can help you choose the right data from a range of possible options, and our process provides ways to view data through an equity lens so that your interpretation of the unfinished instruction in your district will lead to learning recovery for all students. I'll say that one more time. Right data viewed through an equity lens can offer a comprehensive picture of unfinished instruction that will lead to learning recovery for all students. I especially like the point that Elizabeth brought up, that this is giving us a lens into what we as systems and school leaders need to do to equip ourselves and equip teachers to give our kids the best possible type of instruction. So that's what this tool and this process is designed to do for districts and for schools. I'm going to come back on screen now along with Elizabeth, and we'll be ready for a question and answer portion.
Yeah, and I would just, before Emily starts, encourage folks, we have a few more slides that'll tell you about resources from today and opportunities to collaborate with us on the toolkit. So we'll do Q&A for just about 5 minutes, and then we'll jump into those resources if you have a little bit of time to stick around.
Yes, so I do encourage everyone to stick around. We are planning to go for about 15 more minutes, and as Elizabeth said, we've got some great resources to share that you won't want to miss. But if you do need to get off, I will just remind everyone that we are going to send an email out tomorrow with a link to the recording and to the slide deck. So you won't miss anything if you have to get off the line now, and also those materials will be available for you to review and to share with colleagues. So because I know Elizabeth and Josh have talked about a lot of information today, and we really appreciate that, Elizabeth and Josh. It was a wonderful dive both into the toolkit and also into really looking at what equitable instruction and unfinished instruction is. So lots for us to think on and move forward with in our districts. So let's go ahead and get to some questions, and we're not going to have time for all of the great questions that came in, but we'll get through as many as we can with the time that we have left. So first, Josh, let's just start with a technical question. Not really technical, but we had a lot of people who were really intrigued by that saying, the path to end equity is paved with technical fixes. Do you happen to know who said that and where they can access that?
Yes, Ruha Benjamin wrote a book called Race After Technology, and she talked about ways in which racism can show up in the way that technology is employed. And her point with that quote was this idea that in our rush to provide technical fixes, inequity can actually live in that too. And so that's something that can be applied not just to race and technology, but also in what we try to do with schools, right? We try to really focus that kids have access or packets. That's a technical fix, and that's important. But also what the tool is pushing us to do in this process is, well, then what is the quality of what they're being given and how can we improve that, which is more of an adaptive piece. So that's where the quote came from and how it really applies to education as well.
Thank you. That was helpful. All right, so we're going to take a couple questions about the toolkit first and then shift back to some of the information that you shared, Josh. But first off, Jennifer asked, can you talk a little bit about how these tools assess the quality of instruction that's been provided?
Yeah, so there are obviously limitations to how you can understand quality in the current environment. So the way that we're thinking about it is understanding quality through the lens of stakeholder experience. So some of the questions, for example, in the student survey are, open-ended, like what was your experience? And then some of them are more directed, really asking about when you struggled, did your teacher provide you with the same grade level materials and help you access it? Did they give you easier work? Did you get a response? Kind of digging into, what happened, in this instruction space between you and your teacher. And similarly, questions like that pop up for teachers and for parents and guardians on those surveys. So quality of instruction is really rooted in stakeholder experience, where I would say, if we were doing this a year from now, where we had more time to dig into remote instruction, you would obviously want to include observation and feedback cycles from coaches and from principals. There are other elements you'd want to include. So to be clear, the scope of how we're defining it is relatively narrow here. And then we're also defining it in reference to the quality of materials. So are students having access to, through their instruction, grade level standards and content?
Real quick, Emily, before you get to the next question, Elizabeth, what I especially like about the tool that we created is that we actually ask students how their experience has been. And we also ask parents. Oftentimes we try to do education by asking all the adults without asking the children, how are you doing? How are you accessing it? How are you enjoying? Were you challenged today? And this tool gives student voice a chance to live and thrive, which can better inform all that we do. So I really love that about our tool as well.
Yeah, and Josh, thanks for bringing that up, because we did have a lot of questions about what stakeholder voices are included. And as Josh just said, it does really hit on the key pillars of everyone in the system. And so you're going to be able to get that input and compare those different experiences and see how you can move forward in the fall. So thanks for bringing that point up. Diana asked that, for some suggestions on how to get historically marginalized populations to respond to the survey. A lot of times those groups don't respond to research and surveys, and that is really important. That's the focus of this toolkit. So what are some suggestions for trying to get that participation and input?
That's a great question. I have a lot of ideas, but Josh, do you have any you want to throw out there?
I want to just do some framing, and then whatever solutions you have, I'm sure are going to come right within that framing. And so one to think about, of course, how do we get historically marginalized people to respond? But it's really more about providing historically marginalized communities the opportunity to respond. So if we increase our opportunity or give them more opportunity to respond, then I believe we'll have responses. Because really the issue, I know of a lot of teachers and community members and students who have a lot to say about education, a ton, but they don't have a variety of opportunities to respond. So I just would like us to think about not how do we get them to respond, but how do we provide a variety of opportunities for them to respond. So I know that some of the suggestions you have, Elizabeth, probably speak at that.
Yeah, and I would just say also, like, there's a huge and long history behind why marginalized communities aren't responding, right? There is a deep and systemic oppression and racism that is embedded in our education system that relates to that, right? I won't open that book right now, but I will say, having, that framing and that understanding of, like, are we providing opportunity, and are we really, like, getting creative and pushing ourselves to think about this in new ways? So, one of the schools that I've worked at previously, we had a large population of monolingual Spanish speakers, and we would translate the surveys and we'd send them out hard copy and digital, and not get as many responses as we had hoped for. And what it really took was going out and talking to key influencers in that community and saying, hey, your voice matters. Help us understand how to best put this in front of like your friends and the other parents who are involved in this community. So really going out and saying like, give us some ideas for more avenues, because this is really important to us. So obviously there's some really basic stuff like translation, as I mentioned, and hard copy. Also exploring text-based surveys. So a lot of parents don't have internet access on their phones. So giving the opportunity to complete via text. Other ways to do that are, and we did this as well, like get on the phone to say like, let me walk you through some of these questions. Leverage other parents to engage, right? It's really important that, you know, if you're talking about, you know, parents who feel distance from other parent groups, right? So English language learners, monolingual speaking families often feel like disconnected from native English speaking groups. So have some of those parents who do speak the language reach out and say, hey, I'm filling this out and I really want to make sure your perspective gets heard. Those are a few ideas that, you know, I've tried in my experience, but I think getting really creative and being really persistent are key.
Yeah, that was helpful and a great starting place for people to brainstorm when they convene their teams on how they're really going to do that outreach and get the answers. So again, I apologize, we're not going to get to even close to all of the questions that have come in. I know that Pivot and UnboundEd will review them and absolutely take them into account as they move forward with this work. We'll go ahead and take one last one. And this really refers, Josh, to the framing that you did up front. And it's a big question here for the very end, but we'll dive into it as best we can.
Only easy questions, Emily, thanks.
So unfinished instruction is multifaceted. This is a question from Polly. How can school leaders support teachers in making sure that they're coming up with adaptive versus technical solutions to those issues?
So I think the first part of that is really teaching them that adaptive leadership concept of technical versus adaptive. You know, it's easy actually to access the information and to help them to see that. And then walk with them as the leader, walk with them through what data they're seeing, what responses they're seeing from students, and have them think about what's the technical fix to this and what's the adaptive piece to this. A lot of coaching and leadership isn't necessarily telling people, it's actually walking with people, partnering with them, and working through the issues together. Because the people who have the problem are best equipped to solve the problem. And so I think first talking about technical and adaptive and just giving that teaching, but then saying, how does this apply to a particular problem? For example, if a child is missing some sort of idea about central idea or main idea, the technical issue is, okay, now I understand they don't understand, I've identified it, it's concrete. But the adaptive issue is finding out, where is the issue? Is it that they don't understand the actual skill, or is there a reading issue that's there? And then that informs what our solution will be. I can provide an adaptive solution if I'm looking below just the score results. And I think walking through that process with teachers will help inform both administrators and teachers as to how technical and adaptive shows up. And really in this space, that's really, really important. I want to just end with one little thing. I know we have to end with the conversation. I've been thinking about, as a parent and even as a leader of professional development, what's missing when we transition from a traditional setting to a blended learning and remote learning situation. And what seems to be missing are feedback loops between teachers and students, right? That idea of, you got something wrong, now I'm going to work with you, or you got something right, and now I'm going to work with you to get you to that particular aspect. And I think that's an adaptive issue that we really have to think about as we start planning for whatever the new normal is. How do we incorporate feedback loops in an equitable way in a remote learning environment? And that's an example of an adaptive problem that really will lead to long-standing educational success.
That was a great thought to end on and a great illustration of what we have talked about. So I know we want to share some resources, so we'll move on to that. And again, thanks to everyone who sent in questions today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you,
everybody. Yeah, so the questions that we didn't get to, we will address in our FAQ document that we'll be sending out soon to anybody who registered for the webinar. You'll get the webinar recording and the deck along with a link to download the toolkit tomorrow from us. And then both the pivotlearning.org and unbounded.org websites have a lot of great resources on curriculum implementation, on equitable instruction. So we would encourage you to take a look at those. And then we have a few specific opportunities that are coming up available. So we really want to, this is our prototype of our tool that we're offering to you all, and we want to know, like, does it work? Is it actually helping you? And so what we're going to do is we're going to have up to 3 districts that we'll select from the larger pool of folks who joined us today who reach out. We'll do 2 free 1-hour consultations by Zoom, where we'll talk through in one of them the planning phase of the tool, or the analysis phase of the toolkit, helping you analyze your data and work through that analysis protocol, and then the planning phase of the toolkit, so thinking about how you turn those findings into action. And then we would highlight that work with our broader community so other folks can learn from your great experiences. So if you're interested, email curriculum@pivotlearning.org and we will reach back out and let you know if it's a fit for working with us and partnering with us. And then there are also some amazing opportunities with UnboundEd coming up this summer.
Absolutely. We're so excited. We can't meet in person right now, but we will actually have an online UnboundEd virtual summit. It's coming in June. So please let us know that you're interested. Also contact us at engage@unbounded.org for more information on all of the learning opportunities. We'd love to walk with you about this equity journey and what that looks like in practice. I'm thinking about that survey from earlier, right in the middle of our presentation, and it talked about many people providing guidance, and many districts have provided guidance on equitable remote instruction, but only 5% have deepened their competence in equity and cultural proficiency, and even less, 4%, have collaborated to craft a definition. We can help you do that. So we'd love to help you do that with this tool. So please just contact us at engage@unbounded.org for all of the professional learning opportunities that we can provide. Because equity work is hard, but it's impossible without a partner. Let us partner with you. We look forward to that.
Yeah, and I can say I've been to their institute, I think 5 times, and every time my mind is blown. So I very much encourage folks to join.
Absolutely.
And then additionally, we are collaborating together on a much more robust toolkit with a suite of like facilitation and support ongoing, and using a toolkit for doing a sort of needs assessment at the beginning of next year. So as you begin your next year, really understanding how are we addressing unfinished instruction, and how are we building a plan that really responds to the needs of our students and our staff. And then I know there were some questions about the resources we mentioned in the slide, in the deck. So this slide describes some of those great resources. And again, Josh just scratched the surface of some of these concepts. And so I would dig in if you're not familiar with them or want to know more. They are great resources for leaders at every level of the system. Yeah, just a last reminder that we'll be sending out information tomorrow, and just want to thank you all for the opportunity to share some of these resources. Really appreciate your time and attention and thought today. And if you need more information, our emails are below, and we would love to chat and connect more about questions or implementing the toolkit or thinking about unfinished instruction.
Yeah, we really appreciate your time and so much engagement on this call, and people staying all the way from the beginning to the end. So many people. We look forward to working with you and partnering with you to give all of our students the learning that they need and deserve.
Thank you both. Thank you both, Elizabeth and Josh, and thank you to Pivot Learning and UnboundEd for bringing this great program to us today and the toolkit. We're excited to share that with everyone, and you will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording and to the toolkit. So do keep an eye out on your email inbox for that. Sometimes those emails end up in your spam folder, so take a look there if you don't get it by end of day tomorrow. Also, the materials will be posted on the Pivot Learning and UnboundEd website, so you can head head out there to find these resources as well as many others. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day, and we hope to connect with you again soon.